Hello, hello, and welcome. I'm Mehran Khalili. We are DiEM25, a radical political movement for Europe, and this is another live discussion with members of our coordinating team and friends of the movement, featuring subversive ideas you won't hear anywhere else. And tonight, our topic is something that really shouldn't be controversial, but it is: the movement of people. Yes, Europe has recently swung way to the right on migration. Nearly a dozen European countries have now taken unprecedented steps to deter migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers from reaching their borders. Poland has asked the EU to suspend the right to asylum. Germany has brought back border controls. Italy is pushing ahead with its plans to open offshore centres to process asylum seekers. And EU leaders are also considering ramping up deportations, aiming to send desperate people back to their countries of origin. Politico summed it up this way: if you think Trump's policies are extreme, look at the EU's. And these proposals come after a surge in support for anti-immigrant parties across various elections in Europe, with many citizens in host communities increasingly hostile to migrants, according to polls. And they all point in the same direction: a fortress Europe. So what's really driving this new clampdown on migration? What does it mean for the future of Europe's approach to migration and for human rights? And in this current political climate, what should the left's response be? Our panel, including our own Yanis Varoufakis, who's just joined. Hey, Yanis. And including, we've got Miguel Duarte, the migrants' rights activist and sea rescuer. And we also have with us today Marie Badan, the human rights worker and board member of Mera25 in Germany, based in Berlin. We've got Federico Dolce, the spokesperson for Mera25 in Italy, and Amir Kiai, the policy brain of DiEM25. So we've got a great panel for you today for this topic. And of course, we've got you out there. If you've got thoughts, comments, rants, ideas, things that you want to say, just put them in the YouTube chat and we'll put them to our panel. Yanis, could I ask you to kick us off? No, then I will ask Miguel if you will please first kick us off, and then we'll move to Yanis later. Miguel, could you tee us up with explaining this, what's actually happened recently for people who may not be aware in terms of the rightward shift in migration policy in Europe? Miguel.
Hi, everyone. Sure. So there's a lot to say. Definitely, this is an extremely complex topic, but I could say a few things about this recent, let's call it a proliferation of border violence over the past years, maybe a couple of decades. This has included lots of different new methods of inflicting violence upon people on the move. There's been proliferation of detentions and the building of detention centers in European soil, proliferation of attempts to deport people on the move, a criminalization of migrants' rights activists and humanitarian workers, of which I was one of the victims. I spent some years being investigated in Italy for aiding and abetting illegal immigration for the work of sea rescue that I do in the Central Mediterranean. One of the many cases of these serious accusations in Italy, and I think it's important to say that every single one of them has been dropped. The last one being our own, and it was dropped in April this year. Right. So there's also, to get a little bit more specific, maybe Germany has reinstated border controls recently, made it easier, for example, or is trying to make it easier to reduce social security benefits, for example, for people who are in the position of being detained and deported. Famously, Italy has built these two detention centers in Albania. All of this has cost enormous amounts of money. Italy has pledged to spend about 800 million euro over the next 5 years in these small detention centers, small comparatively to the number of people who are actually crossing the border. 16 people have been taken to one of these centers, and every single one of them has been returned some of them because they were minors, some of them because the courts ruled that it was illegal to take them to Albania. So I think, there's something. If there's something that I would like to bring to discussion and hear your opinions on, it's whether these measures are actually made to solve the problem that these right-wing politicians are saying that they're supposed to do, in the sense that much like the Rwanda deal with from the UK, I mean, these measures are not. You can't scale them, right? They cost enormous amounts of money for a very small amount of people, right? So it seems to me that there's some aspect of performative cruelty to this, right? There's that these governments have been elected on a pledge to stop immigration. They have not done that, of course, right? As we see, and so they must, perform these acts of cruelty to basically show the public that they're being, sufficiently tough on migrants. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Miguel. So the act of trying to deter migrants by, as you say, performative cruelty. Yanis, floor is yours.
Thanks, Miguel. Thanks, Bernd. Let's begin with a startling fact. Migration has not increased in volumes in terms of the percentage of humanity that is migrating since 1960, which is indeed a startling fact, because whoever you ask out there, whether they support Fortress Europe or whether they welcome migrants, the crushing majority of people out there are under the false impression that migration flows have magnified, have increased substantially over the last decades. It's not true. Yes, there are many, many more millions who are migrating since 1960, but there are many, many more billions of human beings on the planet. So if you look at migration numbers as a percentage of humanity, it's around 3%. It was 3% in 1960. It is 3% today. That is the volume of migration. Now, this is not surprising. What is not surprising? The contrast between public perception and reality. We see this in other areas where there is a moral panic being stirred up by the alt-right. For instance, take crime. In most Western European countries, as well as in the United States, crime rates have been falling steadily over the last 30 years. But if you ask people out there, is crime getting better or worse? Most people will say it's getting worse. So it is perfectly possible to have a huge, huge contrast between the numbers, the actual facts, and the perception. And the reason why you have this major gap is politics, and particularly the politics of the alt-right that are weaponizing fear and scaremongering and hatred for the other, fear of criminality, in order to bolster the the powers of enforcement of an order, an establishment, a system which is in deep crisis. The next point I want to make is that every time in Europe there has been an internal crisis, a systemic crisis, which has nothing to do with foreigners, nothing to do with migrants, nothing to do with asylum seekers. But every time in the last 150 years that capitalism has been falling on its face and finding it very hard to get up again, every time unemployment has been going up, every time social discontent is rising, every time there is an inflationary crisis, every time there is a deflationary crisis, every time the majority of working people are finding it very hard to make ends meet, with mathematical precision, with statistical certainty, there is a rise in xenophobia, there is a rise in the fear of the other, which turns out evolves into a moral panic over the foreigners that are flooding our societies. We saw this during the 19th century in Russia, in Ukraine. The pogroms of the Jews were the result of substantial declines in economic activity. We saw this in the Ottoman Empire as it was crumbling. The nationalist xenophobic fervor turned the Ottoman system into an otherness targeting machine, with the persecution of the Armenians, of various minorities. We saw it, of course, after the First World War, in Germany, in Croatia, in Italy, northern Italy in particular, with the emergence of the fascist Nazi narrative that the capitalist crisis was caused by the Jew. In more recent times, this is on a personal note, let me say, I could see it coming. I could see it coming from the 1970s, 1980s, I'm old enough to remember that, onwards. European capitalism entered a very long-term internal contradiction when in the early 1970s, the United States jettisoned Europe from a dollar zone. That was the end of Bretton Woods and the beginning of the European Union's attempts to recreate a common currency, first with a European monetary mechanism, then with the euro later on. Every time the European capitalist cartel had difficulty creating demand for its wares, every time there were inflationary periods or periods of very high unemployment, including in Germany, there was again a moral panic. I remember clearly the way in which the spirit of Brexit infested Britain when unemployment went up from 700,000 under the Labour Party in 1979. Within 2 years, under Thatcher, it was 4.5 million, from 700,000 to 4.5 million. While the left was fighting a losing war to preserve communities, to preserve jobs in the mining industry, in the steel industry, in the car industry, in the printing industry, and so on, the right was weaponizing a xenophobic narrative, which eventually led to the absorption of all anti-systemic energy, especially in the working class areas of Britain, by the Brexit agenda. Even under Tony Blair, it was Tony Blair who invented the fictional threat of the bogus asylum seeker. There were serious numbers of asylum seekers that were causing any kind of difficulty to British society. British society was falling into a black hole as a result of Thatcherism, which Blair, through Blairism, simply extended. But suddenly they found, just like the Nazis in the 1920s and 30s found the scapegoat in the Jew, the Tories found the Romanian, the Spanish, the Portuguese migrant in Britain as the real issue to worry about and to blame for all the trials and tribulations of the British working class and the middle class. As we were approaching 2008, and I was, as an economist, I could see that this was coming. You only had to look at the levels of private debt in Britain, in the United States. You only had to look at the exposure of the banks in Germany, in France, to American wagers, on derivatives in Wall Street and so on to know that it's coming. It didn't take a rocket scientist to recognize that. My great fear was that a major financial crisis would give rise to a major humanitarian crisis, social crisis, as it did after 2008, which would then turn the finger on the migrants, on the asylum seekers. Now, Miguel mentioned the various attempts to subcontract migrants and asylum seekers to what we used to call third world countries. Okay, I don't like calling them developing countries. To the global south, let's say. I experienced that process, the genesis of that process, when I lived in the 1990s, mid-1990s in Australia, because that's where this begins. The idea of shipping asylum seekers to a faraway, godforsaken place where they are going to be housed in a concentration camp in a poor country that will be bribed by a Western country to essentially violate international law on refugees and deny the right of asylum seekers to seek asylum. This was the invention of a weasel of a man, a very poor excuse for human nature, a certain gentleman who's still alive called John Howard, who became the Prime Minister of Australia in 1995, if I'm not mistaken. I lived there back then. And I watched it. Australia didn't have, Australia is a country of migrants, right? I mean, the only natives there have been subject to a genocide by the migrants, by the British and the Europeans who followed them. So Australia doesn't have a problem with migration. And given also that Australia is separated by huge and very turbulent oceans from the rest of the world, it was very difficult for boat people to go to Australia, and few managed to get through the boat people. But John Howard wrote the textbook, like Joseph Goebbels wrote the textbook on propaganda in the 1920s and 30s in Germany, in Nazi Germany. John Howard wrote a textbook on how to weaponize a massive, overblown, utterly irrational fear of asylum seekers, okay, into a campaign of misanthropy that shifts the whole of a social democratic country, which is what Australia was in 1995, to the ultra-right. Simply by pinning all blame for all discontent on a handful of boat people. And he did this by using patriotic tones for establishing the premise that no one has the right to violate our borders. And if these people come in without a visa and without the proper documentation, they are the equivalent of an invading army. And we are talking about, 20 families, with children and some elderly people with them. By doing this, he pulled the whole of the political spectrum in an ultra-right-wing direction, because the Labour Party, which was his main opposition, and they became complicit. They are absolutely dishonorable in that, and to be condemned, not wishing to be painted as non-patriotic. They bought the agenda. And very soon, Australia was shipping to Nauru, a very poor island in the Pacific, in a concentration camp that the Australian government built, asylum seekers who were there deposited as souls to be encased in a tin can and to be forgotten. The British government's, the previous British government's attempt to send asylum seekers to Rwanda, or today's Giorgia Meloni's attempt to send asylum seekers to Albania, the current Dutch government's ideas of sending them to Uganda. I don't know whether you've heard about this latest atrocity. This follows the John Howard playbook from the mid-1990s of how it's got nothing to do with asylum seekers. It's got nothing to do with the problem of migration. Absolutely nothing to do with that. It's all about destroying any possibility of a progressive movement, because if the center left, as it happened in Australia, and as it's happening across Europe now, is forced by the Melonis, by the Dutch government, by the British government, to shift to the ultra-right by essentially advocating for an utter violation of international law, denying people the right to cross the border and seek asylum. That's what international law grants every human being on the planet as a right. The attempt to ship out human beings of their own color and their own religion, in inverted commas wrong, to countries populated mainly by this riffraff, brown people of their own religion. This is a fascist project for Europe. And by making it front page news, these ultra-right-wing politicians are succeeding in making it impossible for the political center, center-right, center-left, ever to return to a kind of quasi-humanistic agenda as Europe once had. So this is what we must understand. It's got nothing to do with migration per se. Allow me to close with a note or a footnote to what I said at the beginning. And remember, I said at the beginning that migration has not increased in volumes in terms of percentages since the 1960s. But one thing has changed. And what has changed is that Europeans are no longer migrating, not en masse. Up until the 1960s, for 1,000 years, up until the 1960s, Europeans were migrating to the rest of the world. We were colonizing the rest of the world. We were sending shiploads of people to Australia, to New Zealand, to South America, to North America, to Asia, to Africa, everywhere, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and so on. What has changed is that Europe is now, because of the demographic changes, getting older. Its population is shrinking. And therefore, the natural flow of migration would be for people to come to Europe. But because of the permanent crisis of European capitalism, which is becoming now a catastrophic crisis as a result of the inane handling of the euro crisis in 2010, which, that crisis never went away. We are living through it as it amplifies and intensifies and accelerates. This crisis has given rise, just like the mid-war period has given rise to neo-fascists, who are not just in their own parties, but they are also rising up in the center left and in the center right. Throughout. This is the difference with the mid-war period. Now, fascism is rising up in the radical center. Whether it has a center right or a center left complexion doesn't matter. And therefore, this xenophobic turn, this racist turn, is preventing Europe from doing that which would be in the interest of Europe, accept the fact that we're getting older and that we need migrants. So instead of discussing how migration will be managed in a way which is mutually beneficial to Europeans and to the migrants that become Europeans, we have this toxic, fascistic tendency to, on the one hand, penalize the people that are caught on the boats at our borders and sent to Rwanda, sent to Albania, or put in concentration camps within Europe or in the desert, the Sahara Desert of Libya, while at the same time, of course, Europe cannot stop migration. Migration is proceeding one way or the other. So the only impact of this discussion that we're having is to turn into pure toxicity our politics, our debates, the very fiber of this continent called Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanis. And we've jumped straight into the root causes, which is great, of the swing to the right in terms of migration policy. Marie, Badan. Yanis talked about the moral panic that's being stirred up by far right parties, stoking xenophobia and also economic stagnation as root causes of these of this swing to the right on migration. Would you agree with that? Would you look at other root causes? Take it wherever you want.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Yeah, generally, yes, I do agree with those root causes, and also maybe just to add to that now in the context of restricting migration and this extreme shift to the right across the political board, and in fact that irrational policies around this. So, I mean, restricting migration is presented as a solution to all sorts of problems, social, economic, and security, of course. And that means that no restrictive measure will ever be enough, because those problems won't go away, even if there was this possibility for the last migrant to be pushed back at the EU borders, or even much before, which is an illusion anyhow. So the EU and its member states, they have been in this loop for such a long time, and we've gotten to a point where there's this consensus on anti-migrant policies across the political spectrum, with only like a very few exceptions. And it looks like it's very, very similar dynamic, with what happened also with the neoliberal consensus, where like suddenly there's just this kind of this shift of the, whatever was in the political center every further to the right. And actually talking about what's concretely being implemented in terms of policies, many of the current measures that they actually violate both EU law and also national law, but nobody seems to care about this anymore. Like Germany, for example, you already mentioned that, it has reinstated border controls. And in fact, by the way, it's already been effectively since 2015 that on certain borders, the controls were reestablished. And that is against the Schengen border code. It's like this regime of the freedom of movement within the EU, or like the Schengen members. And the European Court of Justice and also German court, they confirmed this. So actually it's the government coalition here in Germany of Social Democrats and Greens and Liberals who apply this illegal measures. And it's not even the far right. I mean, so yeah, in light of this, like a vision of open borders seems to be, as a political vision, currently quite delusional. But in fact, I mean, it's the current situation that's completely unsustainable, and there's no vision at all, because Fortress Europe, I mean, it's an illusion anyhow, and it's not even good for the people here, as Europe is getting old, as also Yanis already spoke about. I mean, this is not to say, of course, many local people here, indeed, they face problems, and they are, and those problems also, they're not imagined, they're real, with the broken public services, underfunded schools, which have their root causes somewhere else in the neoliberal austerity policies over the past decades already. But most politicians and media, they confirm and they fuel this anti-migrant sentiment, and then they hide behind it in their policies, and then suddenly, what the people allegedly want, that must be done. And with regard to other issues like ending wars, for example, the people's word seems much less relevant there. But I think also, after all, local people who feel threatened by immigration, they share something very, very basic with all migrants, which is that they want a home that's safe and feels familiar. So also many migrants, not talking about those fleeing wars and persecution, but for all I know, many also, many don't want to leave their homes or settle in Europe permanently, but they don't have a choice. And at least not one that gives them like a reasonable option to choose from. And they've made this huge sacrifice to get here, paid loads of money, been traumatized and brutalized on the way, and won't be allowed back in, even if they leave. So, if entry and exit were safe, then the situation would be very different. I mean, I remember when the first Eastern European states joined the EU, there was this scenario here where like the entire East would be empty and everyone moves to the West, and I mean that didn't happen. And that's just one more example of countless examples of those kind of scaremongering scenarios that don't play out the way they are described, be it the minimum wage, the minimum wage, and like I remember in Germany when minimum wage was introduced, there was or now every time there's a raise, that there's this scare that all the employers will leave Germany, and or taxing the rich and the super rich. There's always those fear scenarios, or the current supply chain law and the EU directive that is now again being at least also from the German side restricted. So these are all examples where we know it from experience that in fact that the reality is something else, and that's that's the obvious reason why. I mean, we should never buy into those scenarios.
Thank you, Marie, and well said. I mean, this is one of those topics that really touches that kind of soft zone in people, the in-group, out-group dynamics, that you can bypass people's rational minds and really get them behaving in ways that maybe they wouldn't normally behave in other situations. Let me give you two comments from the chat now. Thank you for all your ideas and comments, all of you out there. BFG says, since migration is weaponized by Russia, it's more important to have a strong outside border, but one that is enforced and properly taken care of by all members. Germany is slacking at the moment. So quite a different point of view from BFG. And Robert Cox, referring to what we were just talking about, ancient reptilian instincts can be used to promote fears of others being dangerous. And when awakened, humans rise above materialism. When spiritually awakened, humans rise above materialism and embrace higher values. So ending on an optimistic note there. Federico Dolce, our spokesperson for Mayor 25 in Italy. We're still looking at root causes, and I would like to shift to more kind of what we can do later in this chat, but just focusing for now on the root causes. Are there anything else, any other things that you would look to? I mean, I've read some polling data that suggests that some trust in institutions, that the fact that nobody trusts anymore our institutions, that this contributes to this very fertile ground for far-right parties to exploit these fears, and also the collapse of religion, leading to a rise in nationalism. I mean, I'm just putting these ideas out there, but are there any other root causes that you might speak to?
Thanks, Maran. And yeah, it might be very well the case. I mean, for those who don't know right now, this last attempt by Giorgia Meloni with this Albanian bid has been stopped by the judges due to a technicality, due to a bureaucracy problem. And we are living here in Italy a week of very intense clash of institutions, ones against the other, that surely don't help with the trust in institution. But I think that hoping in these technicalities, hoping in bureaucracy, it's not the right thing to do right now, because this is a system designed to fail. This is what we have here in Italy is a bureaucratic hell that surely didn't help the trust in institution, and just gave very poor and very little result. What we do is, right now we try to implement this center above sea, and as brutal as it might sound, this is nothing but a step further on a path that we took more than 2 decades ago from both center left and right wing parties and governments. And the problem is that the center that we try to very costly build in Albania, we already have here in Italy, where we don't experience much higher quality of humanity. Only this year in 2024, we had 36 suicides of people temporarily detained in these camps. And this is not a response. This is not a response designed to actually work. This is a hellhole where we, in essence, we deny people a legal way to enter the country. We force them to face a brutal and deadly journey to reach our shores. Then we incentivize those people to apply for asylum because it's the only way they can stay here. And then we find as many as possible way to deny the asylum. And we can deport them because it's very costly, and it's a very high number of people. And therefore, we gave them an expulsion order, and hoping they will live on their own, which they won't do. And therefore, they forced to leave sans papier as illegal migrants at the mercy of organized crime and exploitation. Now, this is a system designed to destroy the trust in institution, to not provide any results. And it's a very extremely costly system. We spend around, each year, we spend 4.5 billion euro to ensure it. And the whole Albanian operation will add 800 million euro to the cost. And then just think of what we could do spending that money in a much better way, try to give them a chance to actually be part of our community. And why we do it? Because it's a very effective political move to gain votes from feeding of fear-mongering and indignation, and because in the long term it raised the desire in the people to give the government free hand to deal with it, and in spite, of course, of every human right. So yeah, it's a political move. As Yanis explained, it's a natural outcome of the system we live in, and what the institutions are turning to. Like a comment said, the European institutions are rapidly following this path, and it's something that, in my opinion, the left is lacking of addressing, lacking of giving an alternative view, or at least the center left, the moderate left, because they are sharing the premises of the far right. They are setting up the table for them. They are sharing the premises that these people are weapons. They are sharing the premises that these people are a problem just by existing in the wrong place. And as long as we keep sharing that values with the far right, we will not tackle them seriously. And that's probably the first thing we should do when we try to think of something up to resolve the problem, to imagine a better society for us.
Thank you, Fede. And moving in onto solutions. Well, just to expand a little bit on what you were saying, you were talking about the return hubs, the Italian so-called return hubs, which means that rejected asylum seekers will be sent far away from the EU borders, and therefore out of the public eye, away from media, and just basically stuck in a detention center, which of course is just utterly inhumane and terrible. So it's good that that's not going forward, although I believe the government is trying to push for it to go forward, right?
They've been stopped by a technicality, and they've solved the technicality. They just issued a decree when they say that they expanded the list of safe origin countries, because the problem was that these people were coming from not safe origin country of origin, and now by decree they decided that Egypt and Bangladesh now are safe countries, and so now they can be deported, because that's how we solve things. And
Yep, sounds like a EU solution. Amir Kiai, you're a policy coordinator at DiEM25, and it just so happens that in the coming, I think, month, DiEM25 is going to publish its paper on migration, which lays out a radically different view for EU migration policy. Could you just give us a sense of the key principles of this paper from a policy perspective, what DiEM25's alternative proposals might be to get us started?
Of course, thanks and greetings, everyone. From a DiEM25 point of view, of course, we go back to our values and principles and our manifesto and, the world that we would like to see, right? And hence, we deal with the migration issue, if you like, both in terms of the acute context of this man-made created disaster in some of the hotspots that we see in the Mediterranean. So we look at the acute situation right now. Then we also consider host communities and the situation of migrants that are in the continent, whether it's addressing some of the issues related to accessing work and so on for migrants, or some of the difficulties faced by host communities who are not really supported at all, generally by the governments, to foster community building, etc. And we also delve into some of the root causes, that primarily drive forced migration. So we will also just touch on that a little bit in tonight's call. But I wanted to maybe first go back a little bit into the worrying trend that we see with regards to international law and the rights to asylum, which is getting shredded through state practice. And we're also seeing the same happening in Gaza when it comes to the Geneva Conventions and any other international humanitarian laws. So this is something that we could also eventually foresee the loss of those as well in the next wars to come. So to go back to what are the things that we're calling for, we are definitely calling for an end to the current militarized migration systems. I mean, this also includes shutting down Frontex and closing down detention centers, etc. I talked about the communities and host communities and funding community building in spirit and in practice. There we talk about housing, healthcare, education, etc. And also disbanding and reversing this worrying trend of providing international legitimacy to dictatorships to take in migrants, because that actually is one of the root causes of forced migration. So by supporting unpopular states, as we have seen through some of these deals, it actually creates more forced migration and brings people, forces people to take the difficult decision and journey to head to Europe, in our case, of course. And this is also, I mean, we talked about some of the political reasons for it, and it's a little bit surprising, for us, because we have, the thousands of bureaucrats, elected officials, etc., and the overall agenda seems to be shooting ourselves in the foot. That seems to be the primary line that is being followed. And also this over-reliance on think tanks such as the ICMPD, like the International Center for Migration Policy and Development, that keeps coming up with new terms for example, the return hubs. Now it's becoming a commonly known term. That's just simply a variation of existing mechanisms that Miguel mentioned, that just simply are unworkable. So we are talking about a complete shift that both addresses the acute situation of people that are heading to Europe, people that are in Europe and their current situation. And there we also talk importantly about as well providing a level of political rights to newcomers, because we have like a whole large body of people that are in Europe but have no political rights and are not really able to organize and push for their own agenda or what it's in their interest, etc. So those are like some of the key points that I want to mention from the program, and maybe that might also stimulate some of the chat from the audience. And sorry, last one, Mehran, and it goes without saying, besides the colonialism and post-colonialism, unfair trade relations, there's also the climate change issue that we have to take responsibility for. We mentioned the dictators, and last but not least, the war and the war industry. Because the global war on terror, for example, itself generated about 65 million refugees. And that was already like a few decades ago. We're sitting at around 120 million now.
Thank you, Amir, for laying that out. And there are some people in the chat that definitely agree with tackling the root causes, like we've said, colonialism and war. There are a few comments in the chat, though, on the term open borders. MD says no society can survive open borders in a contemporary world. Silot says open borders is not a good slogan against the right-wing misinformation, since they promote it as lawlessness and complete chaos. We should address their misinformation instead of fueling it. So as I hand over to you, Miguel, and anyone else that wants to speak after Miguel, I want to look at this idea of open borders. Is that what we're saying? Is that something which is that the right term exactly for what the left is proposing here? Or would you qualify that in some way? Miguel. You're muted. Sorry, Miguel.
Yeah, of course. It is the appropriate term, but I think it requires a little bit of prior explanation, because the term has been contaminated through public political discourse. So before addressing open borders, I think we should address borders and what they're for, because like it's been said so far that this is a system that's designed to fail. So I'd like to take that argument a little bit further. So as Yanis said before, border restrictions in general do not stop migration, right? This is a well-established fact. So are they really failing in what they're doing, or were they never intended to do that in the first place? Actually, what borders do is not so much stop the migration fluxes, but to determine the conditions under which people migrate, right? So they determine the right to have rights, right? Because the right to have civil rights, civil liberties is attached to citizenship or legal status, documents, whatever you want to call it. So migrants with no papers are always vulnerable to detention and deportation, and so they're well-behaved workers, let's say. So they're therefore more exploitable, right? They're rendered more exploitable. So border restrictions are about making migrants economically viable, and the Western economies are increasingly dependent on this kind of unfree labor. Ghassan Haj says that he's a well-known anthropologist, says that migrants are best wanted as unwanted, and I think that really encapsulates what I'm saying. So the criminalization doesn't really make less people cross borders, it just makes more people die, right? So in that sense, I wouldn't say that the European establishment is anti-immigration. It's way better described as anti-migrants' rights, right? Because that's what the borders do. They limit and allocate rights. They don't stop people from crossing borders, right? So, and I think this should teach us something on the left. There's a lesson here somewhere, and from my point of view, it's that the left has kind of, to a certain extent, failed from a discursive point of view, in the sense that we've focused on moral arguments when it comes to migration, whereas there are material arguments that would be way more convincing, in my opinion. So we've allowed the debate on migration to be predominantly framed around whether we let people in or not, whereas that question was never on the table, actually. The border question is about equality of rights. And so when we talk about open borders, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about equality, right? We're talking because people are going to cross the border whether we like it or not, right? So the real question here is whether we let them in as criminals or we let them in as equals, right? And this segmentation of labor market, of having free workers, citizens, and then unfree workers, undocumented migrants, it hurts all workers, right? And we should frame the migration question and the border question as exactly what it is, which is a matter of equality or inequality.
Thank you, Miguel. Can I ask you something? Just a quick follow-up. I mean, we've talked about the very emotional and very charged debate that we have here, and how easy it is to weaponize these things from the point of view of far right parties and the media and in general. I mean, you make the economic argument. It makes sense, and you correctly say, I think, that the left has failed by focusing mainly on the moral argument, and sometimes it's lapsed. It's gone too far, and it's called anyone who disagrees with the left racist and fascist and etc. I mean, I agree with that, and that doesn't expand the audience of persuadable people for the left. But then let me ask you: do you think that those economic arguments are going to convince people who are not already persuaded? How do we match the emotional resonance of that in-group, out-group, those in-group, out-group talking points that you see on the right, in order to move people away from that and listen to what we're proposing?
Yeah, it's really, I think the criticism that I'm making is perhaps best seen when we look at the reaction of the parliamentary left towards these, for example, the Albania centers, the Italian detention centers in Albania that I talked about before. The predominance, as far as I've seen, discourse on the left about this is always moral, right? It's always like we should defend human rights and we shouldn't put people in these centers. Whereas, honestly, I think we're really failing to see the aspect that the reason why these centers were built were not to bring the majority of the migrants, or even a significant proportion of the migrants that are crossing the border, right? This is performative. It's bullshit. Pardon my language, but it's really it's a lie, right? And it's put in place to trick voters into seeing these governments as sufficiently cruel towards these migrants, as if that would ever solve the problem, right? So we should shift our focus from this moral discussion of whether we let them in or not again, and we should really focus on migration is an aspect of life, right? It's always existed, right? So, you know, when we talk about migration in terms of whether we would agree with migration or not, it's the same as asking an economist whether he agrees with the economy or not, right? With the existence of the economy. It's just something that will happen in any human society, right? It makes no sense to ask that question. The question is how we deal with that, right? And that's a question of rights, of conditions, and not of whether it's going to happen or not.
Thank you, Miguel. People move, get over it, I think is what you're saying, which I think is a good slogan. Marie, let me bring you back in.
Yeah, I just on what Miguel, you said about the question is, do we let migrants in as criminals or as or legally, and then with the right to work? I think in that context, I would also maybe respond shortly to one of the comments from our listeners about the weaponization of migration, and the need by Russia, I think was the point, and the need for tough borders. So, like, I think also there, it's the question. I mean, so for migration to be weaponized, I mean, that it has to be a weapon. So, I mean, we've seen that now not only with, with Russia and Belarus, but we've had, the Turkey deal, the EU-Turkey deal, and I mean, all those deals over the years. And that's a huge security problem for Europe, and I mean it's a source for blackmail, also from repressive governments. So in that sense, to eliminate that would also be a very, very clear also security argument for Europeans.
Thank you, Marie. And I think that's a that's a interesting point, and something that Amir also expanded on when he was talking about some of the proposals for host countries, right, Amir? In terms of integration, etc. These are also important points that need to be balanced. Amir, if there's something you'd like to expand on.
Just briefly on maybe some of the comments that we're receiving. And I think it's important to understand that the framing that migration is a choice, we have to really think about it. For example, and I don't think people are aware of the amount of impact that 5 centuries of European colonialism has had on the world, or what the impact of war is. So people are now in the 3rd or 4th generation in Vietnam that are still suffering from Agent Orange, for example, or the tons of depleted uranium that was deployed in Iraq. It's still affecting life there. So we have to understand that people we talk about forced migration, specifically, because it's not sometimes a choice, but it's a force. There's nothing else left. And we also have to acknowledge that there is a role that our governments that we elect play. Very few people in Germany are aware that the chemical weapons that Saddam used were exported from Germany, in the 80s, for example. I mean, and that still affects life to this day. So these are like things we have to be aware of. And if we are comfortable with the concept of polluter pays for industry, we should also be aware of current and past policies on what that results in, in that sense, that people, it's not necessarily a choice, it's forced for a lot of people.
Thank you for that, Amir, and definitely agree. The common humanity approach is something that I think is just logical, and the left should use it much more. The idea that all of the people here today in this chat and all the people that are on YouTube, if they just through the lottery of their birth, they're not fleeing their countries either for better opportunities or because they would die in their home countries. And I think it's something that we would all do. Humans have done it since the beginning of humans. Yanis, let me hand the floor over to you to conclude.
Miguel, of course, you're right that migration is a given, and it's not a question of whether there's going to be migration or not. It's a question of how we manage migration in a way that does not violate basic rules of logic, of humanity, and of international law. And here I will take to task one of the commenters in the chat messages who said, "Oh," and Meran read it out, Putin is weaponizing, as Erdogan is, migrants by pushing them down towards our borders in order to blackmail us. And we need to create a huge wall to stop them. No, we don't. One of the great moments in international law was when, after the Second World War, we agreed that there are going to be some rules about asylum seeking. And we decided as humanity, as a species, coming out of the carnage of the Second World War and the awful experiences of the Jews in particular, being denied entry and the opportunity to seek asylum during the 1930s and 40s. We decided at the United Nations, it was a great moment in history, a pivotal moment in history. We decided that it's going to be international legislation that we must all respect, that anyone has the right to cross the border of any country and seek asylum and have his or her asylum request heard under very specific conditions set down by international law. So this is not trespass. Somebody in the chat said, "Oh, it's trespass." It's not trespass. It is a right granted by international law, the law of the planet, the law of the land in Australia, in Britain, in Germany. We've all signed that law into action. The other point that was made in the chat was, oh, maybe there should be an upper limit, a ceiling of migration beyond which our culture is going to be diluted. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And let me ask you this question. Think of this. Suppose we say that N people will be allowed every year. N people. That's not what N is. Think of whatever a number that N represents. And let's say that N people have come into your country, so no more, right? And then suddenly a little Albert Einstein arrives, or a potential Albert Einstein who wants to come and, live in your country. You say no to him or to her. That is absolute madness. So there's no number N that is justified as the upper limit, because there will always be a reason to bring on one more or one less, for that matter.
Oh, we lost you, Yanis. Ah, halfway through your sentence. Can you hear me? Are you coming back? Ah, we lost Yanis, unfortunately. So we'll have to guess what the rest of Yanis's speech was, or no, we will not, because Yanis is back. Yanis, please continue your point before you dropped out.
When something happened. Elon Musk's fault, because I've got Starlink. That's not an advertisement. There are serious problems that people identify with migration, but it's got nothing to do with migration. I remember during the Brexit debates, before the Brexit referendum, I was in the north of England, and there was this nice lady, a left-wing lady, who said to me, Yanis, look, I understand, I'm a socialist internationalist and all that, but in my block of flats, there are these neighbors that I have, 5 Romanian young men who are sharing a flat, a small flat. They all have jobs. They are all migrants. They've all come here on their own without families. And of course, because all 5 of them have jobs, they can afford to hike up the rents. And then the local people can't afford these rents. And I said to her, comrade, tell me the story of your building. She said, oh, it used to be a council house, council flats. And I said, what happened? Then Thatcher privatized them. I said, so the problem is not that these Romanian boys are, renting a flat in there. The problem is the privatization of the council flats. Because if they were council flats, right, there would be no rent to be bidden up as a result of higher demand, right? So we need to fight for social housing. And we have to fight against the Thatcherites and the Blairites who privatized those houses. He said, yeah, absolutely. So I said, you see, it's not a problem with the Romanians. And if the Romanians leave from that place in North England, do you think that more people will come in from the south of England? Your place is going to become, your city or town or village is going to become like, a deserted place. Anybody who's watched Ken Loach's latest movie, The Old Oak, knows what I'm talking about. And allow me just to finish off by saying that, okay, how do we persuade people? It won't be easy, because whether we use economic arguments, as Miguel suggests, or moral arguments, there is a feeding circle. There is a reinforcement mechanism between austerity, discontent, xenophobia, austerity, discontent, xenophobia. And that is a reinforcement mechanism, a doom loop, which produces discontent and xenophobia, while, as Miguel says, we still have the migrants around. And it's very, very difficult to break that on the basis of arguments, whether they're economic or rational or emotional or moral or ethical. But we have to keep trying. So I do not separate, Maren, the emotional, the moral from the economic. For me, it's both. Europe needs at least 1 million migrants every year in order to keep its population steady. Now, this is a startling statistic, and it can be verified very easily, right? So let's lead with that. This is the economic argument that Miguel might appreciate. We need 1 million people to come in every year if we're not going to go into a demographic decline the way that Italy is going through a huge demographic decline, Greece, Germany, and so on. Point number 1. Point number 2. The fact that there are people who are prepared to pay 5,000 euros each coming from countries that 5,000 euros is equivalent of a fortune, right? They pay 5,000 for what? For the right to get on a boat that will take them to Lesbos or to Lampedusa or somewhere, where the probability is at least 30-40% that they will drown. So they are prepared to pay 5,000 euros, given the probability that they will drown, to come to our shores when we need 1 million people. We should fly them to Europe business class. It will be cheaper. Now, that is a powerful argument. This is how you fight the fascists, not with racism and xenophobia light, but with radicalized, rational humanism. I'll leave it there.
Okay. Thank you, Yanis. And with that, we've gone a little bit over time, so we're going to close. Thank you to my panel, to Marie Baldan, to Miguel Duarte, to Amir Kiai, to Federico Dolce, to Yanis, of course, and also to David Castro for all the production work that he's done behind it. David never gets mentioned, but he does these every time, and he does a great job. And thank you to you out there for your thoughts and comments. The conversation will go on, hopefully, in the YouTube comments. If you like what you've seen tonight and you would like to get more involved with DiEM25, our movement, then just go to diem25.org/join or /donate to support us. We've got no big backers. Every penny counts. And if you'd like to stay informed of the videos that are coming out, the next ones, then please just hit the subscribe button, and we'll see you at the same time, same place, 2 weeks.